So what I'll do is hand over to Daniel, and really looking forward to your presentation to us this evening.
All right, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Coming through?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right, I'll just get my screen share up and running, and hopefully that comes through for you all. Can you see my screen now?
No.
Yep. Okay, cool. Thanks. I first did this talk a few years back. I think it was at one of the last conferences here in Melbourne. I've done it a few times since then. And it's a pretty popular talk with a lot of people. Some people are familiar with Scrum. I tend to find people are less familiar with Kanban, at least at a particular depth. So I guess they know enough to be dangerous, but not enough to really get deep into it and get the most out of it. So, what I wanted to do is to show you how you can sort of, usually you start with Scrum and you can start to apply Kanban over the top of it and get some additional benefits out of it. So that's a bit about me. This photo is also pre-COVID, so I've got my ISO beard going on over here in Melbourne. And years ago, I went and got certified as a Scrum Master. And because I started, just around about 2000 professionally, and then sort of 2000, 2001, we were kicking around with a few of the different Agile methods, and we looked at Scrum and played around with it a little bit. And then kind of when I was looking for a job about, 2010, I realized people wanted Scrum Master certification. So I said, oh, okay. So I went out and got that. But anyway, I soon after that started to get an interest in Kanban. So I learned a lot more about that. And over the years, I've gone on to become an accredited trainer and a consultant through Kanban University. So I've really gone into Kanban with a quite a large depth, and got trained up by David Anderson himself, who literally wrote the book on Kanban. So hopefully a lot of what I get comes straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. But most of you are probably familiar with Scrum. Usually when I do this kind of talk, people understand Scrum pretty well, and it's your usual thing, with your product backlog, sprint backlog, your cadences like your Scrum meeting and sprint planning and all of that sort of stuff. And then hopefully at the end of it, you get this, potentially shippable product increment. You don't necessarily have to, ship at the end of the sprint. It could be mid-sprint, it's up to you. But hopefully at the end of the day, you're shipping that product and you're shipping the things regularly that give value to your customers. So I think that's one of the key things of Scrum. And when I looked at Scrum, I always go back to the Scrum Guide. So I'm not sure if you all read the Scrum Guide, but I usually read it myself once every 3 to 6 months or something. I dive back into it and just check it again. Typical of the Scrum Guide, I noticed this once 10 years ago that I went to write a talk or a presentation or something about 10 years ago. And the people behind the Scrum Guides went and updated the bloody thing. So I had to update and talk. And the same thing happened here, actually, when I pulled out the quote from a few years back. Scrum Guide have actually gone and tweaked it a little bit. So, and this is what it is right now. I had to go back and check the Scrum Guide. So I'd recommend you always go back and check the Scrum Guides, because Scrum does evolve. It's not a static thing. It continues to, show improvements and things like that. But, essentially at its heart, Scrum's a lightweight framework. And that's what this is about. And it's supposed to help, teams and organizations, generate value, usually through, it's usually have a fairly big product focus, with the product backlog and potentially shippable, increment and all of that sort of thing. And I like the use of the terms, adaptive, and complex problems. So, you're not dealing with the, overall simplistic things, you're trying to work your way through some complex things that, hopefully lead to some new value for your customers. So that's what I really like about Scrum. It's quite a basic framework. And I'm not sure if we mentioned it, but if you do have questions, I do, run these things fairly conversationally. Just if you have a question, chuck it in the chat. One of the facilitators will ping me if I haven't noticed it. And we'll sort of try and answer the questions as we go. But if I get too many questions and we start to get bogged down, we'll just have to move on, because I think we've got a time box. We want to finish right around 8 o'clock. Is that right, folks? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So I mean that's Scrum in a nutshell. And some of the things that I really like about Scrum are the Scrum values. And I think people don't go back to this often enough. And I think they're really important. So I like to highlight it, because I do think there are parallels between some of these Scrum values and the things that we do, and the values in Kanban. So, we've got things like commitment, courage, focus, openness, and respect. All really, good ideas that we bring to the table when we're working together. And, the pillars of transparency, inspection, and adaptation, are all really important for Scrum. Obviously you've got the retrospective process where you go through and you inspect and adapt. But I think the transparency thing is also, really important to make sure you have those open conversations that you need to move forward. But the Scrum values are really, quite important. Yeah, I will share the presentation afterwards. Arthur's got the link, all the slides, so we'll put it onto the meetup afterwards, so there's no drama for everyone. I'm going to contrast Scrum for a minute with Kanban. So Kanban is a management method, okay? And we use it to directly improve service delivery, okay? So whereas Scrum uses the term product, Kanban will use the term service. We use it for catalyzing improvements and evolving your business to be fit for your customer's purpose, okay? That's not to say it doesn't work in government. It's the same sort of thing. I was actually just talking to my wife today about the way government engages with citizens, and it really needs to be along the basis of almost treating them like they're your customers, and those same sorts of things, and providing great experiences, and making it easy to deal with, and actually providing a bunch of services. So Kanban, contrasts with Scrum, and Scrum's a lightweight framework. Kanban is more of a management method. Okay, but they do have quite a lot of similarities, like particularly in the values. Where I think Kanban is also quite different is this the evolutionary change. There are similarities, but there's also differences. So start with what you do now. And so you respect current roles and processes, at least initially. And then you gain agreement to pursue improvement through evolutionary change and encouraging acts of leadership at all levels. Now, this can be somewhat different to when you implement Scrum right off the bat. So if you start with Scrum, you're looking at the Scrum roles. So you're looking at someone to play a Scrum Master role and product owner role. And they might not be familiar with that. I've seen that a lot of times in organizations. People don't know exactly what those roles necessarily need to do. And even if you've had training, I think there's some roles, particularly, I actually find the product owner role really tricky. That's not one that you can just learn in a course. You actually have to do it and practice and learn and talk to colleagues and all of those sorts of things. So I think, learning and starting with Scrum is different with starting from Kanban. You kind of need to start up those roles and try and do them in a way that is going to be effective. But with Kanban, you don't necessarily need to change those roles right off the bat. You start with where you are right now. And I've actually found the same with SAFE and things like that as well, where they do training and then they do a rollout and those sorts of things. It's different with Kanban. The idea is you start with what you do now. And one of the great things about that is that you lower the barrier to entry. And I think it also, I think it also accords with what we saw in Scrum, the Scrum value of respect. We use the term respect current roles. So I think there's a good respect for people and their identities in those roles, and we don't want to threaten that too much and put them off, any potential change. This, to me, actually, one of the things that I really love about Kanban is that first statement there. So it actually has some change management parts to it, built into it. You probably don't know that if you haven't gone into the depth, but it's one of the great things about Kanban, that there is some guidance around how to manage change and improve the maturity of the groups over time, and start to accelerate those improvements. And ultimately, going back to the service delivery and improving that for your customers. Okay, the Kanban practices. All right. You'll probably have heard a lot of people saying, yeah, we've got a Kanban, we've got a board, we're doing Kanban. But that's very, very shallow. And I'll show you the difference potentially between, what I refer to as a visualization and then, an actual Kanban board. But the visualization is really important. A visualization in Scrum's not necessarily a compulsory thing. It's not necessarily compulsory in Kanban either, but most Kanban implementations pick it up because it's pretty low-hanging fruit. And I know I've been with some teams where a manager has called me and saying, "Dan, I've got a new team. I need to figure out what's going on here." I said, "All right, let's start to visualize this." And within a few hours, there was a big glaring problem that we saw through the visualization. And he's like, okay, I know what I need to do to start to focus on improving this stuff. So the visualization is a really important aspect of it. Limiting WIP, or WIP stands for work in progress, or some people say work in process. So we tend to try and constrain the amount of work that's in progress. For those of you that are feeling tired and overwhelmed, this is what Kanban can bring you in terms of unburdening teams. We actually do promote that a lot. With Kanban, you do want to help unburden teams and get the most out of them. And the limiting of the WIP and some of these other things are there to help you do that. Managing flow. So I think this is a real key part about Kanban. We said it's a managing method, and we're managing flow. And I think it's quite different from traditional project management. It contrasts it fairly well. So I think sometimes if you do traditional project management where you're managing, and optimizing resource efficiency, you're actually screwing up flow. So the two ways of managing things are actually quite different. And really, when you get to understand how this really works, you'll get a feel for it once you've developed that sort of lens and can see how flow works. Making policies explicit. So that's just, making people understand how the work works. Yeah. A lot of people here are probably in the technology industry. And I think, the folks that are in the technology industry spend a lot of time creating technology systems, but they don't actually focus much on their system of work. And that's where the policies are really important, is that we try and make sure everyone understands how the system works. Feedback loops. There are several feedback loops in Kanban there are some overlaps between what's in Kanban and Scrum. So at certain levels of Kanban, we have things like retrospectives, but there are other feedback loops and things that we do. But that's not to say that things like the sprint review is mutually exclusive to any of those. You can still do your sprint review and those sorts of things that you have in Scrum. And of course, improve and evolve. So like Scrum has its retrospective process and those sorts of things. Kanban has its own set of improvement cadences and ways to go about doing it. And there's probably a little bit more depth behind some of the advice in Kanban on that than what you get out of just the pure Scrum guide. So one of the great things about the Scrum guide being light, it's really easy to get started. One of the flip sides of that is it doesn't give you a lot of depth in terms of going into a lot more detail. And there's been a lot more come out in Kanban over the years to help support you in the detail. All right, should we use Scrum with Kanban? Why would we overlay Kanban on our existing Scrum team? So that's kind of the way it works, because you start with what you're doing now, and if what you're doing now is Scrum, then you apply Kanban over the top, and then you have what we call Scrumban. Okay, so again, respecting your contextual domain, sort of understand where you are right now. I like applying Kanban over the top of things because of the humane aspect of it, and unburdening teams. Like I've worked with some teams that are getting absolutely smashed, Whether it's Scrum or not, it doesn't really matter. But, I like to get in there and start to use things like the limiting WIP and managing flow and explicit policies to help unburden teams and let them unlock their own real potential. You get to manage competing risks, and I'll show you a little bit about that when we talk about class of service later on. Evolve to where you need to be. And for me, at the end of the day, it's really about your customers. It's not about whether you're doing Scrum or Kanban well. It's around how are you doing for your customers, and your organization. And that's really the key, So I try not to be too dogmatic about those things, because at the end of the day, the customers are the one paying for your time. Have to be solving their problems in the best way. I like this quote from Mike Cohen, actually. I saw this from him a few years back, and because I always got in trouble by people saying, that's not Scrum, and I'd say, I don't care, but I think there's a lot of dogma around it. And Mike said the Scrum police are those who are quick to tell us any time we're doing something that isn't Scrum, and I want to tell you I don't care, and neither should you. And I think that's, to be honest, I think it's actually built into Scrum itself. The retrospective process is there for you to improve and evolve. And if you found a better way of doing something that goes outside of Scrum, that's a good thing. Scrum itself isn't static. It improves and evolves. And if you found something that works better in your context, by all means, go and do it. Don't get stuck in the dogma. I honestly think it's built into Scrum, and and we should be using that to get better and better. And if you create something that's second, third, fourth level, whatever it is, improvement on Scrum, I think that's great, because again, you're doing it for your customers. All right, where do I start? I've got a Scrum board. I'm doing Scrum. Where do I start? Okay, so typically I see Scrum boards that look like this. We've got a sprint backlog with some stuff in it. We've got some stuff that's in progress, and we've got some stuff that might be done. So usually at the end of the sprint, you want to try and hit your sprint goals and get a bunch of stuff done. What I'd like to distinguish here is I refer to this as a visualization. I don't call it a Kanban board. Kanban boards are visualizations, but not all visualizations are Kanban boards. Okay, there are some things missing here that you'll need to do to sort of improve this to the level of being a Kanban board, and I'll show you some of those examples now. Okay. Have we got any questions so far? I haven't really had any questions on some of the early stuff. I'm about to go right deep into it. Is there any questions? No? Okay, I'll keep rocking and rolling. If you do have a question, just chuck it in the chat.
So I had one question, Daniel.
Yep.
So on the previous slide, you were saying, Mike Cohen was saying, if that Scrum police are quick to tell you when you're not doing something, when you're doing something that's not Scrum. But what about people that say Scrum as just doing stand-ups and then no documentation? Then, in a sense, having some sort of strict thing to say you've got to do certain minimum things for it to be Scrum. Is there kind of a limit that one can go to say that you need to have the following things in place for it to be Scrum? Or
yeah, and I think I'd come back to the values. I think you can go through the motions and just do the ceremonies, but I think if you've really internalized the values of Scrum, the commitment, courage, focus, respect, all that sort of stuff, the inspection and adaptation, I think that's where you want to be. You want to be beyond just the ceremonies and things like that. And it's okay just to do the ceremonies, just to get started and to learn, get into the rhythm of it. But I think you want to get past that. You want to go past just the motions. You want to really, go through and internalize, the courage and respect and those sorts of things. I even like that, courage was in the XP thing, so you should really, should have the courage to speak out, be transparent, try new things. You're in the domain of the complex in many cases. So, you're going to, probe and respond, sense and respond and those kinds of things. The answers are not necessarily forthcoming, and sometimes you've got to have the courage to step forward. So, I wouldn't want to do tick the box kind of Scrum sort of stuff. I want to go to the depth of the values and internalize those. Does that kind of answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So one simple thing that you can do is you can start to limit the volume of cards in each sort of area. Now, this is a very simplistic version of that. But putting WIP limits in place is something that can catalyze further improvement. It can actually create closer teamwork, and it can create cross-skilling and knowledge sharing. And these are things that start to emerge that you don't expect. There are these side benefits that are a little bit counterintuitive. And it actually makes your overall system of work less fragile, because you've got the teamwork, you've got cross-skilling, you've got knowledge sharing. So some of these things can be really beneficial. This is just a simplistic view. I'll go into a bit more detail. But the humble WIP limit is really a great catalyst for things that come at higher levels. So you can, when you get into the detail here, you can actually encourage some really good behaviours. One way of doing that is I'll go to the next slide and I'll tell another story. So what I've seen quite often is unbalanced workload, and I'll go through this example. Now, what I've done is I've changed this board a little bit, and I've gone from in progress and I said development and test. So now I've got a little bit more detail of what's actually going on in the workflow. So it's not just this in progress. I'm actually describing the workflow in a little bit more detail, even though this is quite simplistic. But actually, this is a sort of scenario that I first come across about 10 years ago. And this is the kind of thing that I did to solve that scenario, about 10 years ago, because I saw teams were overburdened, or at least particular members of these teams were overburdened. And, I really wanted to help them, and not only for making sure that they don't get stressed out, but also, to make the results and the outcomes a lot better as well. So what we noticed, typically, I've seen teams, you might be starting off with Scrum, you might be a little bit experienced with Scrum, but I've seen this happen quite a lot, where teams would start the sprint. In Australia, most Scrum teams are doing 2-week sprints. So I'm just going to go with 2 weeks for the purpose of this example. And, you notice, on day 3, some of the developers have pulled in a couple of cards, they're working on them, and the testers are going, okay, I don't really have that much to do just yet. Developers, can you chuck something over the fence so we can get on with something? And then what happens, developers go, yeah, it's fine. No, it's all good. It's all good. We're working, we'll just pull a couple more in, and they're halfway through the sprint. The testers are going, I get a little bit nervous here. We're halfway through and, we haven't actually started any testing there. Developers go, no, that's cool. We're on the way. We'll just pull a couple more in. And what I've actually noticed is they tend to get stuck in development there. And we're now on day 7 of 10. And then on day 9 of 10, the devs go, hey, here you go. And all of this stuff lands over the fence and the testers go, oh. And, when it happens the first time, then they freak out because they've only got, they want to try and get through these things within a day or two to hit the sprint goals. So, they were sort of had not a lot on for the first part of the sprint, and then they're really freaked out at the end of the sprint. And meanwhile, the developers are going, you got all that done, and that kind of, sometimes there's an unbalanced thing to the way that the work's working. And, it's not until you actually start to explode the workflow in a little bit more detail that you see these problems. Because if everything was just in the in progress column, it's hard to see it. And I think that's the thing with the visualization. You want to be able to see the problem. So you have to set up the visualization in such a way that it allows you to do that. Okay, because this is the problem with knowledge work. So all of you are probably in the knowledge work business. We had a story about a camper earlier, and I'll tell you a story. I've got a caravan myself, and we know the people who actually manufacture the caravan. And I distinguish knowledge work with, sort of manufacturing work, because he said, oh, come down and check out the factory and have a look around and all this sort of stuff. And he took me on a sort of walk through the factory. And what I noticed, I could see stuff everywhere on the factory floor, and when they were building up the cabinets for the caravans, you couldn't fit more cabinets in there. There was no more space. So, because that stuff has a physicality to it, you can see it, you can trip over it, it gets in the way. Knowledge work is something different. You can't see it. It's usually quite invisible. So this is why we need the visualizations to help us understand what's going on, where are these things, So it's really important for knowledge work that we get these visualizations going. What I've done in this kind of situation back 10 years ago is I started to smooth the flow with WIP limits. So what I did is I just put little numbers here, like dev here, 2, test there, 2. I can't remember if that was the exact number. I think it might have been. I think we had more developers than testers, and the numbers might have been different. But this is kind of how it played out. It means no more than 2 tickets in development, no more than 2 in test. So the developers will start, and they'll start the first one, but it very quickly goes out into test because they're not pulling another one in until they finish the first one. So it's already, on day sort of 3 of 10, it starts to look a little bit even where, something has already popped out for the testers to have a look at. They're starting to get busy early. And that is also part of the, creating a faster feedback loop. If a tester's finding a problem in a story early in the sprint, it means then, maybe the developers can change their behaviors just that little bit earlier. And maybe they stop writing those bugs accidentally into the software, for example. And then as you go on, because we've got this WIP limit here, they're not pulling in 6 things without getting them done. They're sort of pushing them all on. And we've already got something done sort of halfway through the sprint. Okay. And again, as you move through, these things start to flow a lot more because, the people that are actually doing the work, they're not context switching. They're actually focusing on something, getting it all the way done, and then moving on to the next thing. So it actually, you get more throughput because, you're not just constantly distracted with all these other things getting in the way and context switching. And it also allows the testers to be a lot more productive. So you can see in this sort of movement that, the testers weren't working busy, frantically from day 9 and 10. They were sort of starting to work on stuff by about day 3 or maybe even day 4. So you can see for them, it's a lot more, they'll probably feel a lot more productive. They'll probably pick up a lot more problems because they're not being rushed. So you quite often see little upticks in quality as well. You get faster feedback coming into the devs about those potential problems, so the devs can readjust. So, I think there's an element of, taking the burden away from the teams. The developers are also, they also tend to feel a bit better about that because they get that sense of achievement earlier. They get this stuff done and they move it through. And they can also see stuff move to the done column on the board relatively early in the sprint too. And gives everyone a bit of a sense of things are going okay. It's not just this last minute, drop over the line.
Daniel, there was an interesting question about if you've got iterative development where testing is incorporated with the development work, what that would do in terms of the way you're managing that workload.
It depends on how it works. There's no 2 Kanbans are the same. So there have been, instances where I'd write the acceptance test or acceptance test creation in a column before development. So I'm not sure if that's what this person's talking about. It might be that the developers actually do a lot of the testing naturally through their development cycle. It could be those kinds of things. So I'm just curious of, is it Kerry, is it? Like if you wanted to expand on the question a bit, I'm happy to hear more about this.
So I actually come from the DSDM side of the world, as opposed to more formally Scrum, although I have been in the Scrum environment for more years than I care to remember. But Kanban itself, I often get asked, how this can be utilised for that iterative development cycle, where we've got, so we typically will have people coming from the business in to do testing as unit testing, and then our testers do that more end-to-end testing within our actual time box. So it's a constant cycle of testing and double testing. It's like a double feedback loop that's in there. But I actually have, particularly government clients, funnily enough, they love having Kanban boards because of the visualization. They absolutely adore having it there, and they see it as a really beneficial way of working. But they also see that they're struggling to get across, well, we've got stuff in development, but we're actually working in a cycle where, as we're developing products, we're testing it at the same time, but surely then it should be in the test box. So just really thinking about a way that, there's a balancing act between the two so that they understand it. And I like what you're saying about acceptance criteria, of pulling that through as a alternative.
The other way that I structure this as well is I say that the heading on the column should describe the predominant activity in the knowledge discovery flow. It's not the only activity. So just because something's in development doesn't mean zero testing happens. Yeah. But the predominant activity is development. Okay.
Right. Cool.
So I think that's probably the way to do it is understand what the predominant activity is. Like sometimes people put an analysis column in before development where they, sort of try and understand what's the acceptance criteria, or what's this story going to achieve, or whatever it is. But that doesn't mean that zero analysis occurs in development and testing either. So predominant knowledge, predominant activity in the knowledge discovery workflow.
Cool. All right.
So maybe one way in which it can be done is the first column could be something like prototype or thin slice or something, and then you could have an elaborated version as the second one, and then you end up with the third one being the product that's finished. Something like that, maybe.
And you see what's happening now? Now we're discussing the workflow. We're trying to understand the system of work better. We're trying to collectively get a better understanding of the system of work. And that's what I think the Kanban conversation can encourage. It can encourage the team to get a better understanding of how it works. And when they do that, they get a better understanding of how they can improve it. Yeah. So I think it can be really beneficial. And one other thing that I wanted to add, and I'll probably just go to this slide. When people say the Kanban, they quite often mean the board. But when I say the Kanban, I mean the slot. Okay. So that's a bit of a different paradigm shift. So the slot is, in here, development has 2 slots, testing has 2 slots. It's based on the WIP limit. So we have a slot for 2 cards or 2 activities. Okay. So it's really about, do we have the capacity to do the work? And, it starts to encourage a pull system of work. Okay. So the Kanban is the slot. Okay. Not understanding handoff. So again, just building on the point that I mentioned before, you start having discussions around, okay, what does dev done mean, for example, and, we start to create these policies of, okay, for example, it's got to pass the blurdy thing on the CD pipeline, or, so it's got to be checked into Git, it's got to be reviewed by a something, and, it's got to pass all the automated tests before we dump them into the actual test environment and do some exploratory stuff on it. And so, usually the folks that are downstream help define what's needed for upstream. So the testers are going to say, well, actually, for you to get done, I need A, B, and C in place, so that I can do my bit. So again, that helps the collaboration. The team gets to understand what's going on at each step, and we put that on the board, so it's there for everyone to see. It's a bit different in the virtual world. You really need a decent Kanban tool that allows you to do that, because some of them, like Jira, just don't support this kind of thing. But you really need to, sort of get that understanding, because it creates a smoother flow of work when everyone knows how everything works. The other thing is, we want to actually also see when tickets are ready. So, if tester moves B into done, then they want to see, okay, what's ready to pull from development. So there are a couple of ways to do this. Put some sort of little marker on the thing that says it's ready. or you can even put a little column like this, so they just go straight to the done queue and pull the next thing in like that. So there are different ways that you can do this, and notice that this to implement applies across both in progress and done. Again, get a proper Kanban tool to do this. You can't do this kind of thing in Jira without hacking it quite substantially. All right, there's also different types of work in your system. I quite often see Scrum teams, you know, get a bit all out of sorts when different types of work come into their system. For example, this is just, we've got projects and support work here. I'll put some recommendations about tools later so that you're aware of it. But so support work, you know, it comes in differently. Sometimes it even has a different workflow than project work. So, you know, you might triage something in support before it even enters your system of work, that kind of stuff. But you want to make those different kind of, you know, work types visible. And in your sprint planning, reserve the capacity. So I don't know if, you know, you could use card counts or story points or whatever you use, but, you know, I quite often just say, look, let's say we have, you know, 50 points, you know, story points available to us in a sprint. I'm going to reserve 15 of those points for support, and product owners, you can have another 35 points, whatever it is. You know, so that we reserve stuff for coming in for support. You know, and so, you know, we kind of whip limit the number of project work so we can handle those different forms of demand. Okay. Again, it unburdens teams because, you know, it's you generally don't have to apologize too much to your stakeholders or product owner when you say, hey, I've got this thing done, there's no more support work on, can you please give me another ticket? I'll pull something in mid-sprint. Yeah. But you probably get a lot of complaints if you overcommit and under-deliver. The other thing you can start to do is you can start to put in different classes of service with different policies. So classes of service are just really, you know, they describe the urgency. Sometimes we talk about cost of delay, but you can see the policy here on this high severity thing is start immediately. And there's probably something around, you know, if it's a Sev 1 or 2 support ticket, you know, it doesn't matter about this whip limit here, it can exceed the whip limit, just, you know, get the web server back up and running or whatever the problem is. You know, if it's a low severity, you don't exceed the whip limits, but you start within 5 days of receiving a request. So it might land in there, but instead of pulling this, if you're at sort of day 4, maybe you pull the low severity support ticket in first. Yeah. All right, so those are different classes of service. So that's, you know, you can manage different types of risk there. I see this quite a lot with Scrum teams, is that they're doing 2-week sprints, but, you know, when I grab the data for it, you know, I quite often find that, you know, a lot of their stories or whatever it is are taken 30 days or, you know, longer than 2 sprints anyway, 2 weeks. And this is a blind spot for a lot of Scrum teams. And I've seen some Scrum teams even, they say, oh, what we'll do, we've reached the end of the sprint. This is a 5-point story. We're going to split it off and claim 3 points and put 2 points in next week, next sprint. Don't do that. Please don't do that. For one, you know, you're hiding problems. For 2, you're screwing up your metrics, which is going to make it harder to fix the problems as well. So, you know, try and just keep your things, roll it into the next sprint. It's fine. But what you'll need to do is look at the lead times there and actually figure out, how do we get better at actually reducing those lead times? You know, how do we actually get into, you know, a 14-day cycle rather than a 28-day cycle or longer? You know, I've seen some teams, you know, where those things actually go on longer and longer. This encourages faster lead time. It'll also get you some better practice around your slicing heuristics. So check out Neil Killick's work in this space. He's done some great stuff around slicing heuristics. And then, you know, that'll also help speed things up. So you're delivering faster for your customers. You're delivering more reliably to your customers. So look at lead time data and make sure you're handling that correctly. Another form of this is, I'll show you what I mean by lead time data in a minute, is this is a scatter plot. So, when you look at that, you can sort of see, okay, these are some of the problematic tickets. So if I was to click on one of these and drill into the ticket, you can ask what's going on there. It's usually a blocker. Quite often what it is a blocker because you're dependent upon something outside of the team's control. So it's usually a case of you need to focus on how to deal with those blockers. Not always, but often.
Daniel, what's a slicing heuristic?
Yeah, okay. So when you're slicing your stories, they're sort of rules around how we slice them, because sometimes we get lots of variation in our story sizes. So some of them are great big things and sometimes they're little, but we want to sort of have them within, a kind of range, and you kind of create these heuristics or rules by that kind of, feels about the right size for something that's, valuable and achievable. But Neil sort of talks about that in far greater depth and than I can. So yeah, do check out his work. I had him at one of my Kanban meetups talking about this, and yeah, he's really great. So talking about lead time, lead time is, so I've got this to do, or let's should have called this sprint backlog. Excuse me. And we've got development and testing here, and then we've got deployment. Now, in this deployment at the moment, we don't have an automated process, so we've kind of got this infinite queue, and when it gets big enough, we just dump a whole bunch of stuff into prod. But the way you measure your system lead time is from when you commit to it, so say in your sprint planning meeting, up till the first unbound queue. So that's what we call system lead time. So that's based on your system of work. Okay, so that's that. The customer lead time is something a little bit different, because maybe your team stuff is going on in here, but there's a product backlog. Then it gets to sales and marketing. They do their thing, wrap it up, and finally the customer gets to see it later on down the track. So this is really the customer lead time all the way through there. So there are two different lead times, and sometimes you can't necessarily, because you start from where you are, you might not be able to get directly to the customer lead time straight away. Sometimes you have to start at just the system lead time, and then you sort of expand outwards, because sometimes you don't have control or influence over that. Over time, you'll start to get more visibility in those sorts of things. And you really want to start to optimize, obviously, across this customer lead time. But usually, sometimes, some of those small optimizations at the system lead time can help you towards that. Okay. So picking up on the Scrum value of commitment, it's important to understand where you actually do make that commitment to do the work. Just because a customer's requested something doesn't mean that you have to automatically deliver it, So there needs to be that sort of negotiation around, yes, actually we will deliver this thing. There has to be that agreement or acceptance of that request. All right. One other problem area I find in Scrum implementations is product backlog. I find that there's often a lot of work that goes on in managing and refining the product backlog. One team that I worked with, years ago, there was, product backlog. We were building this new feature, and we come up with sort of, I think it was about 75 one-liner stories, at the start. And anyway, the team were getting through about 10 stories a sprint or something like that. And anyway, the BA was madly started scribing down all the acceptance criteria on the stories. And I said, hang on. The team are just doing sort of 10 stories a sprint. You don't need to go and do everything all at once. Why don't you just make sure you've got enough for the next sprint, 10, maybe even do 15 if you need to, in case they're really keen. And then just go downstream and help the testers finish off the last sprint and do those kinds of things. Unfortunately, my advice wasn't heeded to, and this analyst actually went hell for leather and got all 75 stories analysed. And then, partway through delivery, we got about 35 stories done. The product owner goes, yeah, that's enough. We're done with that feature now. So those other 40 odd stories that the BA had analysed was all wasted work. So her time would have been far better spent, going downstream, helping someone else, or doing other things. So, what we want to do is, make this process more visible as well. Make sure teams don't starve for work. Make sure we don't overburden the product owner. As I said, like, the product owner is probably the toughest role in Scrum. So we want to help them as much as we can, and we don't want to have that sort of wasted effort refining stories that are never built. Yeah. So what we quite often do in Kanban is we have this sort of upstream board. So to the left of the sprint backlog, we actually visualize the work that's going on with maybe there's a BA and or a product owner. Yeah. And we limit that as well. Like, if we're only going to take 5 stories in a sprint, don't create, 50 of them, maybe put in a number there that's reasonable. And by the way, that helps sprint planning as well. So if I say, yeah, we're getting through 5 stories a sprint, product owner, we've got 8 stories ready. Out of those 8, which 5 do you want? And they go, dun, 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 done. And usually, so I've done sprint planning in about 5 minutes because, that's all the time it really needed. And the team's like, cool, we know the process, the policies are explicit, and away we go. So then, teams are spending less time in those, boring planning meetings. They're spending more time actually working on the work. It doesn't mean that those conversations don't necessarily have to be had, that happen in that planning meeting, but it gets spread over the course of the sprint. And it tends to, be not as much of a sort of one-off hit. And I also say that, the Kanban board starts to resemble the product backlog on its side when you're looking at it, sort of this upstream thing. We've still got these big chunky things here, and you've got these refined and ready things here. So it starts to look like the product backlog on its side. So, yeah. So also think about not just the stuff that's in the sprints, think about all the preparatory work as well, because that's hidden work. You want to make that visible. Okay, so Scrumban, where does it end? There's no final state. And what I say is there's a lot more in Kanban. I've just given you the very quick overview, if you like, of what Kanban is. There's no final state. Continue to evolve deeper and deeper. Try and serve your customers better and better, and try and beat your competition, I guess, and help your organisation and your team and your people, make life better for them as well. Here's a bunch of further info that I've got. So obviously the Scrum guides, check that out. The Essential Kanban Condensed book. I think I've got this is the Essential Kanban Condensed. You can get a free PDF version of that. There's also, I don't have it here, but there's also a Kanban guide. I might send a link through to Arthur and co around there's a new Kanban guide as well that you can check out. It's really good. You've got the Blue Book by David Anderson, which is, sort of still very relevant. RJ Reddy wrote the Scrumban sort of revolution or evolution book. I met him at a conference. He's a nice guy. He's got a lot of good info in his book there. Henrik Nieberg, and Matthias wrote the Kanban and Scrum, Making the Most of Both. And of course, Corey Lattice, wrote some of the early essays in Scrumban, which was, I think it was circa 2006 or 7. So, I mean, it's been around for a little while. It's not necessarily a new thing, but it can help you out. What else have I got here? I do training courses. So here's a bit of a gratuitous plug, folks. So some of the courses that I do, the Team Kanban Practitioner, which is like I do it virtually now. It used to be a 1-day in-person class, and now I spread it over 3 evenings or 2 half days. I've got the Kanban Management Professional, which you can do too. They're actually 4 half-day courses virtually. So you've got the System Design, which is actually a good place to start with Kanban if you want to understand more about it. And then there's the Systems Improvement. So now that you've sort of got your Kanban system up and running, how do you keep making it better and better? And then, if you want to go on and become like a Kanban coach, there's the maturity model and the coaching practices. And I've got a discount code. So if you want to jump on any of my training for the remainder of the year. Use this Briz Agile discount code for 10% off. It's a training. I've also got a fair swag of blogs. You can see there's one of my recent ones on the Jira Kanban board hack. So for all the things that Jira can't do, there's some ways around it. They're not great, but it helps. But there's a bunch of other blogs there about Kanban and stuff like that as well. What else? Meetups. I run the Melbourne Kanban meetup group as well as the Sydney Limited Whip one. We get together quite often with someone from New Zealand, and we do like combined meetups. And we're going to do a Kanban unconference next week on, I think it's Thursday night next week. So you can come along, and it's sort of unconference style, virtual. So you can check that out if you really wanted to. And I think that's all I've got. So happy to sort of throw to the audience for questions. Arthur, did we have anything in the chat?
Sorry, there are a few things that came up. There was the bit about what are the tools that you think people should be using for the Kanban, and particularly you were talking a little bit about Jira and what it does and doesn't do, but what tools you'd recommend?
Yeah, so there's a couple. The old tool that's been on the market for a while is Lean Kit. That's old, reliable. They probably don't do less new development on that now than some of the other ones. The other ones that are really good out there are Swift Kanban and Kanbanize. They're two good ones as well. There's also, if you're stuck on Jira, because I know some orgs, it's just jammed right in there and it's hard to dig it out. There's a plugin called Nave, N-A-V-E, and that plugin is used to get all of the metrics and data out of Jira. So if you've set your board up, then you can actually get all the metrics and do all of those improvements out of it. So it's a really good one. So there are a few there. So I'll put in Lean Kit, Swift Kanban, and Kanbanize. If anyone wants to check those out, just let me know. I can give you some links with trial versions and stuff, because I've got some links. Some of them give short trial versions, and things like Kanbanize, I give a 3-month instead of a 1-month trial or whatever it is, so you can kick it around a bit in your org.
Different sort of question. Who came up with the name Scrumban?
I don't know. It was probably Corey Lattice originally, actually, when he did those essays, because it was just Scrum with Kanban on the top, and so there it is. What else have we got there, Arthur? What other questions?
Thomas Locke asked a question about the systems thinking approach to implementing Kanban and what your opinion would be on that. And my guess is you do have one.
Yeah. I actually teach it in my Kanban system design class. And it's a good way to start with Kanban. I do another talk on static or systems thinking approach to introducing Kanban. So yes, it's very good. And it steps you through all of the process, and you can learn more about it on my Kanban systems design course. We go into it in quite a lot of detail.
There was a quick little discussion on when if all stories are written down at the start, how many of those stories are done when the product's actually okay. And there was a couple of people saying only 50% of the stories, they're the ones that are done when the product's okay.
It quite often happens,
Now, there's a longer question from Hank about Actually, I think, Hank, how about you come online and explain your question, because I reckon my attempt at summarising this is going to miss it. No.
Yeah, actually, I just read that, and that's quite often that happens quite a lot. So what tends to happen in a Kanban system, because you get WIP limits, basically stuff gets blocked. You know, you won't start new things, and that blockage goes all the way upstream. So usually what happens is those folks that are doing the UAT that are not available, they'll block the whole system of work up. And sometimes they're the same people that are requesting the features to begin with. So in a way, they don't get to request new stuff until they do the work to get the old stuff out. So in a way, it's kind of up to them, you know, if they want more features to make sure the system's healthy. So, you know, if it's a case of they're continually blocking, then, you know, it's probably a question of, should you even be involved in the UAT? Could we get someone else to do it? Is it now a necessary step, or, you know, is there some other way to do it where we don't have that kind of blockage? So I think, you know, having a WIP limit on that UAT column is really useful. And I've also seen that with some teams where they've got it where, you know, at the end there's like the product owner approval, and sometimes in Scrum the product owner is doing their day job or something else, and they're busy in the organization. So it also helps keep those people accountable to the system of work and making sure that they, you know, do that approval, and you know, if they want to be part of the system, that they're actively involved in it, you know.
Yep.
I hope that answered your question, Hank. Just shout out if I didn't.
There's a nice question from Mike about personal Kanban, and how do you limit when you're constantly reacting to escalations, urgent requests, and everybody thinks that they need you now?
Yeah, right. I think, you know, doing that is really important, having that personal Kanban. I mean, I even use a personal Kanban as well for myself, and I've done so for years. Because if you don't have that kind of thing, you're always fighting fires, and you don't actually carve out time for those strategic things to make sure someone doesn't run around with matches all day, you know. And so, you know, that's kind of the thing, is you start to get, you know, unless you're managing the WIP of the different types. So, you know, maybe, you know, respond to spot fires is this many, but, you know, you've got to be really cognizant of making sure that you're acting a little bit more strategically as well. So I'd also look at the volume of work you're getting through. So even on my personal Kanban, I capture the metrics of how often that type of work comes through the system, and how long it takes for me to get it done. And I have my own sort of, in Kanban, we have what we call a service delivery or flow review. And I do that just with my own work, and talk to the people making the requests to make sure that I'm actually focusing on the right things and providing the right level of service to my team. So I think you will get ad hoc things. They're quite normal. It's kind of like that Scrum board that I had, where we had support stuff as well as project stuff. And I think you probably, you know, your personal Kanban board might need to be something similar, where, you know, you're still tracking that ad hoc stuff, but you don't, you know, you still have capacity for the more strategic stuff that is your, you know, sort of, you really want to be focusing on as your day job.
Okay, one more, and just a really quick answer here, hopefully. How many columns or rows are too many?
I don't like to put arbitrary numbers on that, but you'll know, like, because if you've got a wall that's like 4 miles long, you know, if it's a physical thing, or you've got a visual board that's really long, then that's a problem. The other thing is, you know, you've got to start from where you are now. There's this good book. Yeah, I'm not sure if you can see the cover here, but you can see Klaus Leopold's Rethinking Agile, and you see the board sort of snaking around. So if your board looks like this, and then you're optimizing that bit in there, you know, you've obviously got a problem. So, you know, if your board is that big, maybe there's a problem that you need to do something about. You know, maybe you're at the wrong level of abstraction. Maybe the process is way too complicated. But yeah, that's a pretty good book. It's a quick read on dealing with some of those bigger organizational problems. I hope that helped.
So it's kind of like when you can't comprehend it anymore, it's way too big.
Yeah, and is it manageable then when it's, you know, this ridiculously long snake that goes around the room?
Well, I think it might be time for us to be wrapping up now. What do you think, John? Did you want to come on board?
Yeah, thank you, Arthur. And I just wanted to thank Daniel for a really fantastic talk. I learned a lot, and I see by the questions that people were really engaged in. And so what I'd like to do to close off is I've prepared a Menti sheet where we can just put one word in to express our thoughts about the evening. So what I can do maybe is just share my screen with that. And so what I'll do is I'll also put in the link into the chat. If I can find where the chat is, it's over here. So if you guys can go to the link that's in the chat now, you can also go to www.menti.com and then use the code 26041245 and then just enter in any thoughts that you have around this evening. One word to describe your experience.
Yeah, I hope I was able to respond to all the pressure that was there in the early stages of the session.
I reckon you exceeded it, Daniel. Thank you so much. So it looks like the central theme was informative. So and we've got a great as number 2, and well, interesting is now got to number 2. So does anybody want to describe or talk to any of those words? So I see people are still adding it in. So Craig, what were your thoughts?
Thank you, Daniel. I think it's Kanban's always one of those things that's one of those overloaded terms sometimes, and I think that was a good summary of the of the basics and things to think about, rather than as you pointed out before, people just saying I've got a Kanban board, which was always one of my pet peeves. It's like, where are your WIP limits? Where's your policies? Talk about why that isn't a Kanban board.
Yeah.
And it was really practical as well. So it told us, I can imagine myself using those individual use cases and the strengths and weaknesses of each. So that was very practical from our perspective.
Yeah, that's good.
Cool. Right. Well, I'll stop sharing.
I'm an absolute newbie, so I was pleasantly surprised that I could follow most of that. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the feedback.
Cool. All right. So any last thoughts or questions before we close the meeting?
Well, one for me is I'm so glad we agreed to invite Daniel. I thought that was excellent.
Yeah.
No
and Daniel, thank you for agreeing to come and speak to us.
Yeah, no worries. I'm happy to come. If you thought it was great, I'm happy to come back if you ever wanted me to come back again. And I think I gave Arthur a list of half a dozen talks that I could potentially do. So I could always come back and do something else if you were interested in learning more about Kanban.
Cool.
I actually just thought, did you want to make a quick comment about that unconference you're organising?
Yeah, it's nothing too extreme. It's just come along if you've got something you want to talk about or ask a question. It's unconference style, so we'll form into everyone can sort of self-organise into the different rooms around the different questions. So yeah, it's just meetup group. It's virtual, so you can join from the comfort of your own home, and it'll be. I think it's next Thursday night. I think it starts at about 5:30ish or something like that. Because we've got to allow for New Zealand time. So if we start it too late, they all go to bed. But if we start it too early, then everyone's still at work here in Melbourne and Sydney. So yeah, I can put a link onto the events if that's okay, Arthur, if people are interested.